Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. And this is our second webinar delivered by Andrew Wright from Action Your Potential. Thank you very much for joining us today. I can see some of you are kind of just joining in still. I'd like to start in a moment, just when a few more people have joined, with a very quick sound check, just to make sure the audio is working for everybody. So for those people that are already here, if you could just click put yes into the questions box on your screen. You should see somewhere a questions box. Just type in yes if you can hear me, and I'll give just a moment for those responses to come through. Perfect. Thank you to those of you that have popped in a yes there. That's lovely. So if you do have any problems throughout the webinar, just please do use that question box to let me know. It does look like it's working, so that's good news. So yeah, my name is Louise and I'm a project facilitator at the Southern Universities Network. And the SUN is a partnership of 6 universities and part of a wider programme called Uni Connect. And the central aim of Uni Connect is to reduce the gap in higher education participation between the most and least represented groups. And the webinar that you're taking part in today forms part of the staff CPD element of this programme. Today's webinar is being recorded, so you can share it with colleagues after the event. And you're welcome to post questions in the question box throughout the presentation. So we'll have 2 stopping points for a Q&A. And the best thing to do is just to pop questions in the question box as you think of them. So don't be shy about popping them in throughout the presentation. And then when we come to those stopping points, we'll address those and I'll put them to Andrew. Perfect. There are also a couple of videos in the presentation to watch, and to make sure that you're able to watch these at the best quality, what we'll do is we'll copy the link into the chat box. It's just a YouTube link. I'll pop it in there so you can access it, and we'll give you an allocated amount of time to watch the video, and then we'll continue with the presentation. Make sure not to leave the webinar when you do this, and it might just be an idea to open up another tab, paste the link in, and just pop us on mute while you watch and then join us back in. But I'll remind you of that at the time. If you can, I'd really encourage you just to stop for a couple of moments at the end, just for a few short evaluation questions, just so we can get your feedback really. And I'll be keeping an eye on the question box throughout. So as I said, if you had any audio problems or any tech related issues, just let me know and hopefully we can sort them out for you. So for example, if you can't see the PowerPoint that's on the screen now, yeah, just pop that in the questions box and we can sort it out for you hopefully. And of course, just keep on posting those questions for Andrew in the chat box throughout as well. Lovely. So I'm going to hand over to our presenter today, who is Andrew from Action Your Potential. So Andrew, hello. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Louise. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all okay. Wow, what a rapid kind of set of changes we've all had to cope with again at the beginning of the year. Lockdown 3, perhaps the worst ever sequel. So welcome. You can watch the previous session, which was on the 9th of December, like part 1 of this on the, you can get a link. I think Louise will supply you that link in the chat at some point. So today, I'll introduce myself properly in a second. I just want to recap briefly on that last session, because basically what we do as a company is crawl all over neuroscience research, cognitive science research, psychology, pedagogy, and generate sets of materials that are supportive of building in students and their parents and carers metacognitive skills. So well-being, the management of one's mind, mood management, managing cognitive distortions, managing anxiety. And today's session is going to focus very much on learning. So when we looked together last time on the 9th of December, we talked about well-being, and we, like everything we do, we turned it into a series of habits to engage in on a daily basis. Now, there's a lot of research behind these 12 rocks of well-being. You don't need to kind of dive into that research. If you're as nerdy as I am, you're welcome to look at our website. There's a lot of material behind each of these. Every single one of these has a powerful impact on the way the brain operates and the quality of the mind we therefore get to live inside. And that was the focus of the last webinar. Mental health is the same as physical health. It's not something we can save up for weekends or the holidays or retirement. It's something we need to go at every day to make sure that our brain is working in a balanced way, in a connected way, and that we're responding rather than reacting. So we talked a lot about that last time, so I just wanted to mention that. Today we're looking at the cognitive learning side of things, and everything I'm going to talk about has got a lot of evidence behind it. So we turn a set of cognitive science outcomes in terms of what supportive learning and memory, etc., into what we call leaps in learning. And there are 10 leaps in learning. So I've set myself quite an ambitious goal to try and describe to you each of those 10 leaps in learning. And if any of you are interested in any of the research behind this, you may regret asking the question, because there's lots of sort of research behind the scenes, lots of papers, lots of research. I'll introduce myself. So I used to be a deputy head, acting head, Senko in a large secondary school in East Sussex. I've worked in 5 different schools across East Sussex for 28 years, and I set my own company up about 2 years ago, and we're now working with over 100 institutions, so colleges, secondary schools, primary schools, early years, businesses. Basically, the mission is to help everyone understand their brain, work their brain in a different way, to get the most out of it every single day. And that's the name of the company, Action Your Potential. Do follow us on social media, YouTube. We try and publish videos every week, and there's always advice, and we're running a set of webinars specifically designed for staff well-being during lockdown, and also for parents and families trying to juggle home learning, home working, and all that trauma. So at the center of our lives is this gorgeous bit of biological kit, and our mission is to try and help everyone understand their brain. We've learned more about the brain in the last 10 years than we have in the last 10,000 years, and this revolution, generated mostly by neuroscience, but actually what neuroscience is doing is connecting up with what psychology has been telling us for years and giving us lots of detailed reasons as to why certain things happen. It's going to change every aspect of our lives, and our mission as a company is to try and turn all of that into things you can do today to change your brain today. We talk to children about 3 I's: iterative, incremental, and involved. If you do iterative change, tiny little changes that add up, incremental, brief periods of practice every day, and involved, you need to do it with attention and focus, you can change your life. And actually, we're very passionate about closing the gap, which is, you know, one of the things that the Sun Alliance University group through Uni Connect are interested in. We're interested in closing the gap. So the national gap in terms of social mobility, vulnerable, disadvantaged children not going on to higher education. So where is that gap? We would say, looking at the research, working as I have done in 28 years in schools, the gap isn't in the ambition of those children. I was one of those children, a free school meal child myself back in the 1970s. My milk was snatched from me by the Education Secretary, Mrs. Thatcher, at the time. We would say the gap isn't in ambition, it's not in ability, it's in behaviours. It's in daily behaviours and daily habits. And actually, when you support those children to develop those habits, they can close that gap. 85% of a kid's life is at home. At this current moment, it's even more for lots of children if they're not key workers or vulnerable children. So we need to unleash the power of those daily behaviours. And today, in relation to closing that gap, helping us as a nation get people on that social escalator, you know, a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, before all of the disrupted schooling we've experienced, the Institute of Education suggested it would take 50 years to close the attainment gap between disadvantaged and everyone else if we carried on at the current rate as a nation. So we need something new, and it's about being a NeuroNinja, which is understanding your brain, giving it what it needs, working with it in the way it likes to work. So it's about a revolutionary shift in thinking, and inside 3 different strands. So we talked about well-being last time. We'll leave mind management for another time. We're going to talk about unleashing learning. Mind management's all about managing strong emotions and the negative biases built into our brain by our evolutionary past, none of which is particularly helpful when we're trying to deal with complex 21st century issues. No longer worried about saber-toothed tigers, or the tribe over the hill. We've got much more complicated issues to deal with, and the fight, flight, freeze response, let's be honest, doesn't really cut it when you're dealing with GCSEs, when you're dealing with complex kind of things like job interviews, etc. There's a website to support all of the schools and colleges we work with. We do webinars for parents and students and training for staff, and we've got 110 videos, 5-10 minute long videos explaining some of the stuff around the brain. So last time we looked at the 12 rocks of well-being and skill 1. The key idea from that webinar was that the brain builds the mind every day. The mind is a model the brain builds of its own operation. So the mind is different every day on the basis of what the brain's been up to. So whatever skills we've been practicing, they're available in the mind. Whatever kind of worries we've been doing are available in the mind because they've built those structures in our head. So the quality of each day's experience, half of that quality in terms of our well-being is down to what we've done in the previous 24 hours. You know, there's been a national drop in mood for a whole heap of reasons in lockdown 1. One of the reasons is less movement, as people aren't moving as much, so they're sitting in front of screens. You know, human bodies and human brains designed to move. There's a drop in mood after about half an hour just sitting still. That's why I've taken to standing up, delivering webinars and things, because it's just good to move about. So we're looking at these 10 leaps in learning today. So let's crack on, because I've got to get through quite a lot of leaps before 25 past and the first break. So the first leap is know you can grow. So that means whatever output your brain gives you about the fact that you can't do maths, you can't do English, you're really struggling with this. And I'm a trained Senko, and my, you know, I've worked with lots of different young people with lots of different learning difficulties. Actually, our brain is neurally plastic. Our brain changes throughout our lives on the basis of what we use it for. So whatever output our brain is telling us about our ability to do maths, we can improve our mathematics through practice. And actually, we need to be aware that we're living in a neurally plastic organ that is waiting to see what we're going to use it for. So we need to know that we can grow. And this links directly with, you know, that very famous bit of psychology from Carol Dweck, growth mindset, fixed mindset. Actually, neurally plastic brains, we are neurally plastic in the center of our brains. We can grow our skills, learning skills, mathematics, English, etc. We can grow them through deliberate practice. And we need to understand that there are certain things that our brain will find easier, just because every brain's different. Some brains will process language more effectively. Some brains will prefer numerals. Some brains will find hard to learn to read, because reading is actually a very new skill. We only invented alphabets 10,000 years ago. It took the species 4,000 or 5,000 years to invent alphabets and reading. We asked children to do that in 5 years flat. So actually, reading is a really difficult skill for the brain. It improves through practice. Dyslexia is an absolutely real thing, but there are ways that we can support young people to develop those skills. So growth mindset, know you can grow. And we're linking, which is what we do, linking growth mindset from Carol Dweck with what neuroscience tells us about neural plasticity. What we know about brains in terms of learning is they need pairs, and I'll just explain what that means. In order to learn, a brain needs to be exposed to the problem or the pattern over a period of time. It needs pattern and problem exposure. If you expose your brain to the problem or pattern with attention and focus, it will begin to crunch its way through that problem or pattern. You need to make sure that you're engaged inside an kind of enthusiastic approach in relation to that learning. So short bursts of learning, engagement with enthusiasm, and belief in the possibility that you can change. So problem and pattern exposure and engagement with enthusiasm. You need to attend as much as you can. The more attention you give to whatever you're engaged with, it will engage more and more circuits. The deeper the circuits are engaged in the prefrontal cortex and the neocortex, the more likely you are to develop the connections associated with that learning. We need to repeat little and often. If we don't repeat, our brain will delete. More on that in a while. And it's really important to space our practice. We need to space it over hours and days and weeks. Blocked practice, reading, rereading, highlighting, that stuff isn't that helpful. So pairs, little and often learning is the way to go. Currently, schools are configured generally into hour blocks of learning, not necessarily the most helpful structure for the brain, unless teachers use interleaving and spacing, which lots of teachers increasingly are going to do. So that means, you know, you're doing geography, you're doing one topic, you're switching to another in the midst of a lesson. That's much more powerful in terms of the brain beginning to encode that information, even though at the time you're doing it, it doesn't feel as effective. It is much more effective. So we need to give brains access to this structure of pairs. And we talk to children about this. If you give a brain a pairs type environment with problem exposure, engagement, attention, repetition, and spacing, it cannot help but learn that information. That's because we've got this large global neuronal workspace in the middle of our heads, where basically the brain is ready to process experiences in the world and problem solve. So social problem solve and abstract analytical problem solve. Brains are statistical learning machines. From the moment small children arrive, their brains are decoding data, searching through data, drawing conclusions, building patterns in their visual cortex initially, auditory cortex, then in the language centers, and then finally in that global neuronal workspace. They're constantly churning through data to find solutions, and the brain does that naturally as long as it's exposed to the problem enough. And what's interesting from the research now is that the neural plasticity across the brain may actually be linked to the kind of data that's coming in. So our visual cortex and our auditory cortex, they concrete down in terms of the basic structure of those neurons and the way they connect with each other very early in development, within the first few months of the baby being born. Whereas social and dealing with the complexities in the world, those areas of the brain remain plastic throughout our lives, because the data coming in from the social world, the data coming in from the world constantly changes. So plasticity may actually be related to the nature of the signal that particular area of the brain is decoding. Our brain constantly shifts in relation to how we use it. So we always talk to students about daily life experiments, things they can try. And in relation to Know You Can Grow, you're going to need to build a daily self-directed study slot for 25 minutes at the end of the school day on top of homework, and I'll come back to that in a second. And we also, these are slides that we use with parents, we send videos to parents to explain what we're doing so they can support their child in relation to building these study slots. So leap 2 is learn as you go. We say to the students and the parents and the teachers, learning is not one process. You cannot go into a room of kids learning. It'd be nice to be able to do that at the moment, wouldn't it, with that school's not open, but you can't go into a room and watch progress happening. You cannot do that. Learning is 3 processes. Learning is getting the work, understanding it. Learning is practicing it and encoding it into the physical structure of your brain. Learning is retrieving that information. So it's 3 processes, and helping children understand where they are on that journey of getting it, understanding it, practicing it, and using it is really important and metacognitive skill. So getting it occurs across the brain in that global neuronal workspace. Problem pattern exposure, we make connections and we get it. And then what happens is neurons continually fire, and they need to fire in a repeat way. So you've got a neuron here and it's firing. Over time, as a neuron fires, it changes the DNA, produces particular chemicals. Learning changes the DNA in the neuron, in the nucleus of the neuron, generates a chemical which travels out to the synapses of that neuron. Now that chemical takes time to generate, takes time to travel out to the synapses, and that's why spaced repetition, that's why spacing learning is most effective way to learn, because it takes time for that chemical to be generated, and it takes time for it to travel out to the synapses, the gaps between the neurons. When that chemical arrives there, when that neuron fires again, those connections are reinforced. And then what happens is the myelin around the axon of the neuron starts thickening, which means eventually the signal is conveyed much more quickly. So after 5 or 6 weeks of a little bit of repeat practice, you have built very thick myelin around those connected neurons, and the information is being conveyed at 150 meters per second instead of 15 meters per second. Look at that neuron on the left. It's taking a lot more time to convey that information. So we need to learn as we go. We need to make sure we spend a little bit of time each day capturing the information. So we're being taught it and we're understanding it, and we're saying to ourselves in the lesson, we're doing simultaneous equations, say, we're saying, yes, Eureka, I've understood this, that's fantastic, and that's great. And we may assume as a teacher, we've taught that, they've got that, and the kid thinks, yep, I've got that. No, actually, we've understood it. That's not the same as learning it. That's the first part of learning it. Spacing is very powerful. We know that spacing works for every species we've studied. Sea slugs, bees, humans, spacing our practice works because of that chemical and it needing to travel out to those synapses. So we ask students to think about learning as getting it, practicing it, and using it, retrieval practice, and systematically to review their learning day. And we'll talk about that in a second. So leap 3 is understanding your memory, daily memory building. Brains like to remember 3 sorts of information. They're designed by evolution to remember 3 sorts of information. Dangerous information to avoid threats. Stuff that we find interesting, we're going to remember that better because we've got pre-existing memory structures called schema. And repeat information. Think about the school curriculum. Most of it will need to be repeated in a systematic way in order to make sure that it's encoded. Beyond comprehension is encoding. And basically, your brain, if it doesn't repeat information, will forget information at the rate of 70% every 24 hours. And that forgetting is an active process, as active as memory. The reason is brains are designed to negotiate our way through the world. And if they remembered every experience, they would be full within 10 days, despite the fact there's 86 billion neurons, trillions of possible connections. They would be full unless they had this forgetting process built in. So brains work on this basis. If you repeat the information, it must be important, we'll encode it. If it's not used or repeated, then it's not that useful and it will be rubbed out. If you don't repeat, your brain will delete at the rate of 70% per 24 hours. So by day 3 of simultaneous equations, even though you understood them on Monday, by Thursday, it's rusty unless you go back and have a crack at that process. So what we say to kids is, it's all very well, your teacher's doing a fantastic job in lessons and you're doing interventions after school, fantastic. That's all the knowledge pouring in, but your brain is a sieve. Everyone's brain is a sieve, unless we can turn it into a saucepan. It's not going to capture all the knowledge, but we can systematically design a daily habit that will help us catch that information. So neuroscience tells us that we need to develop a study habit. We could just stick our fingers in our ears, like Eddie Izzard here, and just ignore what the neuroscience is telling us, but we need to develop a study habit. Otherwise, we are going to waste massive amounts of time and stress ourselves out with ridiculous cramming schedules for exams. Learn as you go by using these daily memory slots. And we call that slot a self-directed study slot. And we urge GCSE students to have at least one of these slots a day, 6 days a week, and A-level students at least 2 of these slots a day. And we teach the students how to build the habit by repeating that study slot every day at the same time, but more on that in the previous video. And we call those slots Pomodoros, borrowing that phrase from the Italian university student that invented this 25-minute slot. 25 minutes is a good period of time for the brain because after 25 minutes, attention drops off a cliff. So leap 4 is the 12 rocks of well-being, so I'm not going to spend much time on those. Well-being is an integral part of having an attending brain, an engaged brain, a brain with good access to memory. For example, if you don't get enough sleep, less than 6 hours sleep, you've got 30% less memory available the next day. The brain encodes during the course of sleep. So we're going to reach a point in a second where if there's any questions, just bung them in the chat. I'll answer any questions and have a brief pause. So it's really important we bind in this idea of looking after your brain in terms of well-being. And we'll talk about leap 5 in a second. We're about halfway through. Leap 5 is all about procrastination and that constant issue that crops up in adolescent brains particularly, but actually in all brains, is that, you know, when it comes to doing the work, you want to avoid it. you find yourself in a situation where you want to avoid the work, and we explain the neuroscience of procrastination. We'll do that in a second. I'm just going to pause, just see if there's any questions and give you a few seconds. Just going to have a quick glass of water.
If you have any questions at all, don't be shy, and do just pop them into the questions box, and I'll give you a couple of moments just to have a think if you do have anything. Just to refer to the previous webinar and the rocks of well-being. So if you guys didn't manage to watch that, that's no problem. As you know, this is a standalone webinar anyway, but what I will do is pop in a link to the Sun website at the end of the session, just so you can, in your own time, if you want to go back and reference that. It was a really interesting session. I think I definitely got a lot from that about how to look after myself during this very weird time that we're going through, and just normally as well, I think. So I'll pop that link in there for you to have a look at as well. But if you do have anything for Andrew, now is the time in this short stop here just to pop it in the chat box so we can ask him any of your questions. Okay, Andrew, are you back?
I'm here.
Oh, fab, yeah. So just a bit of a reiteration here. So the name of Leap 3, can we just remind ourselves what that was?
Yeah, so Leap 3 is all about daily memory builders. So these are daily habits that build memory through spacing repetition out. And actually, I'm going to talk about some examples. So basically, what schools and colleges that work with us get is 25 5-6-minute videos that they drop once a week, which takes their kids through a program of developing these skills. And we teach them all the different memory building activities that they engage in.
Fab. I don't think there are any more questions for now. As we said, do just keep on having a think. If anything does come to you, just pop it in the chat box, and then we have another little stopping point for questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, so don't wait for it. If you've seen Hamilton and you like the Aaron Burr character, there's a fantastic song in the midst of Hamilton called Wait For It. So don't wait for it is referencing the fact that for lots of teenagers particularly, but actually young people as well, procrastination is a huge issue. They beat themselves up about it. Why do I want to start my work? I just want to wait until I feel like it. We say don't wait till you feel like it, do it anyway. Actually, there are two sorts of motivation in your brain. We explain the neuroscience of the have to motivation and want to motivation. Where does it happen? It happens in our prefrontal cortex. That's the bit of the brain that effectively calls the brain to order. That's where the executive function skills are in the brain. And there are lots of things that build the strength of the prefrontal cortex. The rocks of well-being, for example, sleep, mindfulness, exercise, all of that builds that physical architecture at the front of our brain to drive us forward. So we say to kids, think of your brain as a noisy hall. Lots of circuits, all evolved at different times to do different things. Calling that to order is a massive amount of energy. Brains are quite lazy and they try to save energy. They'll try and use pre-existing structures rather than effort of connections and new connections that are required for learning. So your prefrontal cortex is like the speaker. It is calling the brain to order and saying, we're doing this now. That's effort. And when you sit down, you are going to find circuits will push back. They will say, I don't want to do this now. I want to go and watch a program on Bulgarian knitting. I don't want to do this now. I want to play Call of Duty with my mates. So you need to have a plan every day, and you need to plan your day, particularly in a home learning environment, around levels of activity. So we talk about this way of managing your day. Divide your day into 5 flavors of activity. Cognitively demanding activities, learning, hard work, practice, etc., needs to be done as early in the day as possible. That's when the prefrontal cortex is freshest. It's the bit of the brain that suffers most from fatigue. So it's really important to try and get those difficult things done as early in the day as possible. Curious and engaging activities like reading and watching documentaries and listening to podcasts can freshen up the prefrontal cortex, help our brain recharge. So we've got hard activities, interesting activities, fun, save that to the end of the day. You're never going to forget to play Call of Duty with your mates. You're never going to forget to do the fun things. So save them to later in the day when you don't need the kind of prefrontal cortex to drive you. We talk about chores, have to tasks. that nobody really wants to do. No one wants to do the hoovering, no one wants to empty the dishwasher or the washing machine, but those have to tasks are good practice for the prefrontal cortex. Chores, helping other people, that's a good activity to do as well. And then the 12 rocks, well-being, pepper well-being through your day. So you feel you've done a load of work, you're tired out, you go for a walk, 10-15-minute walk, that'll refresh you. That'll give the blood supply back to your prefrontal cortex. It will help your attention and focus. You're not wasting time. You're managing your productivity through the course of the day. And we talk to young people about using those different activities to get them in that green zone for as long as possible. So notice metacognitively when you're anxious and stressed out, do things that calm you down, your rocks of well-being, chores and supporting other people. When you're bored, do something difficult to get you going, and pepper that with curious and interesting activities. So, and we talked about deliberate rest, I won't talk about that. We talk a lot about this. If you don't plan each day, your brain will choose easy and passive. Not just your brain, every brain does that. Brains love to stick with their pre-existing neural architecture. I mean, flipping out, how many times have we tried to change a habit and we end up stuck going around and around? Because those structures are already there in our heads, and information moves at 150 meters per second inside a pre-existing bit of structure in our head, whereas making new connections is a lot more effort. So it takes time, and we need to keep going at it and going at it and going at it, and we will absolutely fail sometimes. Leap 6 is all about how to bounce back from setbacks. So we really help children understand, and young people, that failure feels awful in the brain, because when we fail at a test, when we don't achieve something, the circuits that are responding to that are circuits that are about survival. And failure in the ancestral environment, if you failed to run away from a saber-toothed tiger, or if you failed to escape that violent tribe over the hill, failure led to death or injury. So it feels awful, but actually failure in a test is not a mortal injury. But those circuits don't determine the difference between failure to run away from a saber-toothed tiger or failure in a test. Those circuits, the message of a test isn't designed for those circuits. So it's really important to understand that we've got a negative bias in our mind, and it's not the end of the world if we don't do well in a test. In fact, the information that we gain from not doing well can be used to help us improve. So nature punished organisms that didn't take uncertainty seriously, that didn't kind of escape. But we need to understand that we're living in this rowdy hall of a brain. Different circuits evolved to do different things at different times, and the message of a bad test result is not for our survival circuits, it's actually for our learning circuits. So our survival circuits don't really need to get involved. They do though. So some circuits focus on survival, some focus on learning. A poor test result or not understanding your work is a message for our learning circuits, not our survival ones. Even though our survival ones go off, we can just let that happen and begin to understand that we need to make sure that we're focusing on the signal, the feedback for improvement, the need to practice more, not the noise of our emotional and survival circuits that are just getting involved and invested in a conversation about negativity and telling us that we can't possibly do it, trying to save us from the stress and strain of having another go. Actually, they're not really helping us, those survival circuits. They did help us once when we were dealing with saber-toothed tigers, but those difficult emotional experiences we get when we have a bad maths test result, that's important, but the information in the test in terms of the questions we didn't get right, that's the most important information. So we need to expect those survival circuits to go off. We need to manage that emotional response, and we talk a lot about that in mind management, but we need to hang on to the feedback because that's what's going to change our response. And we need to be able to respond to those bits of feedback in a positive way. So I'm just going to make sure we finish on time. So I'm going to get to the next leap. The next leap is about struggle. Struggle is the way. Now, this is really interesting. When we're learning something, we should be struggling. If we are struggling, that is reflecting the fact that the brain is having to make new connections, is having to put effort in. If we're finding the learning really easy and it's a breeze, we're not actually learning. we're not really making any major neuronal architectural changes to our brain. And so it's really important to understand that there's this sweet spot, which teachers will know about, this sweet spot where we're struggling, we're outside our comfort zone. So the struggle is the way. And one of the things that we end up doing a lot as a company, working with children that are stuck in their maths, stuck in their English, adults that are stuck as well. So how do we develop a skill or knowledge that we're really stuck on? Well, we're really precise about whatever the area is. So I'll think of an example of a young person in primary school we've been working with who's really struggling with her 7 times table. She's only in year 3 and she's really struggled with it. We turned it into a very intense, deliberate practice slot that she did 5 minutes twice a day for a week, just using flashcards, 7 times table flashcards, 5 minutes a day for a week, twice a day. And within a week, she nailed it. And then we went on to the 4 times table, and then we went on to the 12 times table. And very quickly, she realized that actually she can do it if she turns it into a short burst of practice. So how do we develop a skill or knowledge we're really stuck on? If you think about something you're really good at, something you really enjoy in life, you got good at it for 2 reasons. One, you enjoyed the experience of doing that thing, football, basketball, dance, whatever it is. That meant you did it a lot, which meant your brain got exposed to it a lot, which meant you encoded that into the structure of your brain, so you got better and better at it. The thing about things we don't like doing, if we're struggling, you know, at school I struggle with maths a lot. I've worked with lots of young people that struggle with English because of dyslexia. We don't do that very much because we don't enjoy the experience of doing it, and therefore our brain doesn't get the opportunity to begin to respond to that problem, build the connections that will resolve that problem. So by not liking it emotionally, we don't practice it, and it's the practice we need to do. So we need to acknowledge we're not going to like it, but if we practice it, and if we keep the practice slot as short as possible, so we engage in it, because if you've got 50 minutes of maths and you hate maths, you're not going to do it. But if you've got 10 minutes of maths and you do it often, 10 minutes twice a day, you could put up with, you can still make progress incrementally. So we break it down into small steps through daily deliberate practice, and we design those specific sessions. We call that little and often learning. There's nothing revolutionary about that, but unleashing the idea in kids' heads that they can design deliberate practice slots to crush barriers to learning is incredibly powerful. And it only takes a few rehearsals for children to go, hang on a minute, actually I can design my own deliberate practice slots. And we, you know, give examples to the children and say, well, if you think about that boss fight at the end of the computer level, you keep going back and having a go at that and having a go at that and having a go at that. You need that same determination when you're trying to respond to an area of learning that you're struggling with. So the bigger the struggle, the shorter and more often those practice sessions need to be, until you've reached a point where you've encoded it, and then it's about retrieval practice, and we'll talk about that shortly. Time for a short video, actually. I don't know if Louise can drop that into the box now.
So I'm just popping a link into the chat box. Just maybe give yourselves 1 minute, 30 seconds to have a watch. Open it up in a new tab so you don't leave the webinar. And then if you could just use the raise your hand function to let me know when you're back from having a quick watch for 30 seconds, a minute, and then we'll continue. I'll just put that through to you now. So we'll give you about 1 minute, and then just pop the raise your hand or write in the chat box to let me know when you're back.
Louise, we'll skip the next video. We'll just drop it in at the end, I think, because we won't finish on time otherwise.
Okay, perfect. Okay, perfect. Some of you started coming back. So when you're back, if you could just either use the raise your hand function to let me know you're back, or just pop a little message through to the questions box just to let me know you're back. And then we'll continue. Yep, seeing a few hands going up. I think most people are back now. So I think we can probably continue.
Okay, thank you. So what we try and show with that video, working with the children, is just to basically get them to understand that actually they've got this incredible machine at the top of their necks, and it will solve the problem. If you expose it enough to the problem, it will solve the problem. It may not feel particularly enjoyable because you may not naturally like maths, but actually give your brain exposure to it, and it will resolve it. As long as you don't listen to the story or survival turkets tell you about the fact you can't possibly do it or improve yourself. So leap 8 is chunking it, and leap 9 is quizzing it, and we'll do these two together. So basically, in relation to that self-directed study slot I mentioned, so we're talking about GCSE A-level university students here. So you had your learning day, you get home, you raid the fridge, you do a bit of exercise, you get yourself in a good space, you sit down and you do your self-directed study slot, and you're literally going back in your memory through the day's experiences. You're asking yourself, what did I learn today in geography, for example? What key concepts were the teacher trying to teach me? Every lesson's got a learning objective. What was the learning objective? What were the key concepts and the key words? And you grab some of that information, not all of it, just some of it, on a flashcard, and you collect that information. And then you go through the week and you do it exactly the same thing throughout the week for every subject. So this is designed around a secondary curriculum of 5 subjects a day. 5 minutes, generate some flashcards for every subject with key ideas and concepts, and you then end up with a stack of flashcards which you naturally interleave, and you just read those flashcards every day. That builds schema in your head. So the way I talk to children about schema is, imagine a Christmas tree, the structure in your head where you hold information. Remember, brains remember information that's interesting to it, or that they've already got pre-existing structures for. So if you've already done photosynthesis and you've captured a bunch of information and you've collected it as you've gone along because you followed leap 2, learn as you go, you've then got a Christmas tree in your head, a schema for photosynthesis, and when new information is introduced by your teacher in the next lesson, it sticks to your Christmas tree. If you don't do that work and build that schema, it will smash on the floor of your brain. So the flashcard technique is a way of revising the information that you're experiencing in a short way. You're not going to capture everything, but you will capture a bit of it, and that will increase your memory for the next go through, the next lesson, and you'll capture more. And that's an exponential experience. So every week you're generating flashcards. I say to students, generate flashcards on the basis of different colors for different subjects. So you've always got a stack of flashcards you can go back over to help you with some of the base concepts and base knowledge. And then finally, desirable difficulties. Now, desirable difficulties comes from a brilliant paper by Rob Bjork, which just looks at the fact the brain isn't very good at understanding what works for it. So brains like things to be easy because they're trying to save energy. So, you know, rereading textbooks makes you feel you're familiar with the topic. Highlighting keywords makes you feel like you're familiar with the topic. None of that stuff's particularly helpful. It's much better to engage in desirable difficulties. These are effortful tasks that require a considerable amount of effort to improve performance. The best example is to think about physical skill in terms of exercise. You know, if you're trying to develop your skill as a runner, your strength, it actually is a lot of effort, and it perhaps is a little bit painful, and you have sort of delayed onset muscle soreness when you've had a really good workout. Similarly, when you're engaging in learning, the effort that you put in, while it doesn't feel at the time that you're making a huge amount of progress, when you come back, your brain will have begun to make those changes. Remember, the process of building that chemical takes time to build that chemical. So, you know, past papers, desirable difficulty, interleaving our practice, desirable difficulty, spacing our practice, is desirable difficulty, and unleashing in kids this idea that it's not the amount of time that you practice for, it's the way that you practice. And we teach the kids lots of different ways to do their practice. There's a video which Louise will drop in at the end about desirable difficulties. And just this idea that actually underneath the grind, underneath success is a massive amount of effort. If you want to change your brain, it is effort. And literally that's the way the children talk about it. Effort. It is effort. The analogy with kind of physical development and training is kind of really powerful. So desirable difficulties are chunking the learning, interleaving the learning, past papers, summarizing learning, elaborating, connecting ideas through mind maps, deliberate practice, little often learning. And we teach all of those. Very powerful impact, 3 or 4 times more effective in terms of helping students to learn. And I've mentioned this, but I wanted to reiterate this idea that if we don't make a plan, we're in danger potentially of wasting our days. So I think I'm probably going to finish there actually. So I shall finish with that poster, and we've managed to somehow do all 10 leaps in learning. Now I wanted to do that all together. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, I do understand that, but it is recorded, and do get in touch. I'm happy to go at any of the bits that you weren't able to kind of understand through the detail of the presentation, but you can't really do 5 leaps of learning if there are 10 in one session. So thank you so much for coming along, and I'll hand over to Louise to finish off.
Perfect. Hi. So now is another time, I think, to just have a quick short stop if you have any questions. So this is your only chance to have it, to put your questions to Andrew. We have just a couple of minutes before we'll run some polls for you guys to let us know what you thought of today's webinar. While you guys are thinking, I had just a really quick question for Andrew about productivity. So I would consider myself a bit of a night owl and probably a bit more productive in the afternoon and later in the day. But is that right? If my brain is supposed to be more productive earlier in the day, am I doing something wrong about kind of making myself more productive?
No, that's very true, and that's really important. That's why we make the link with well-being. So, you know, understanding your chronotype, you know, unfortunately for lots of people, being owls, some of their most productive periods are actually, you know, late afternoon, early evening, and you know that's exactly right for those people in terms of their circadian rhythms. But in relation to those periods of productivity, when you're most productive, you still need to put your hard, most difficult activities at the beginning of those most productive periods. You're absolutely right to raise that point. So for, you know, for owls, you know, some people just aren't morning people, and when they say I'm not a morning person, they're absolutely right. They're not. Their circadian rhythm is not set. So when you are finally awake in the afternoon and you feel, you know, that's your most productive period, you put those hard activities at the beginning of those productive periods. You know, for me, who is a lark, that is first thing in the morning. Get that difficult stuff done early. For owls, that productive window might be a little bit later. So that's an important point to raise. Thank you for doing that, Louise.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Just a couple things before we go on to the polls. I know we've got just a couple of minutes. The first one was just to reiterate what all the leaps were called. I think some people are kind of struggling to keep up with the name and the number of the leaps. I don't know if you've got that on I know you have it on a slide somewhere where they're all named.
Yeah.
And then when we have, that's all right.
There we go. I'll put it on the screen as it is.
Yeah. Fab. And then the other point was obviously from someone who came last time and is missing the cameo from your dogs.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. They're quiet today. I'm sorry about that.
Their comment was about the students.
My tortoise is very quiet as well.
Oh, bless him. So the comment was when their students make flashcards, sorry, sometimes they can overload themselves. So where is the stopping point? Where is that kind of sweet spot you're talking about doing the right amount?
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, I'm working with an A-level student at the moment, and he was trying to put the light and dark reaction for photosynthesis on one flashcard. And I was just saying, that's a perfect example of what you've just said. Just saying, no, 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 explode it out. So basically, you know, for an hour's learning, if you've managed to capture 3 or 4 key ideas on a flashcard, it needs to be short as possible. It's much better to spread the learning out over time in small increments than to try and trick yourself, you know, say I've got all that light and dark photosynthesis reaction captured on a single flashcard. It must be in 0.6, and there's literally no way you're going to remember it. So it's much better to do it little and often. And we do know as educators, I'm sure all of us, that the curriculum is ridiculously overloaded. It will be much more effective if we boiled the curriculum down and gave students more time to repeat the information that is the most significant. But that's a whole other webinar, I think, right there.
Yeah, fab, thank you. That's probably all the questions we have time for. What I will just say before we go on to doing the polls is that we have referred to the previous webinar we did back in December quite a bit. So if you would like to have a little look at that, and all of the other webinars that we do at Sun, actually, I'll pop a little link to our website where you can find those webinars, and then you can also hear the famous cameo from Andrew's dogs there as well. So I'll pop that in for you too. No, it was great. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, builders in that day, and they were just going crazy.
It's one of those things, working from home, get to meet everyone's pets. It's great. So
Yeah,
let's now move on to the polls. So if you could just take a little look at the short polls I'll pop in now. I'll just launch the first one and give you a few moments just to answer for me. Perfect, thank you. And then just one more. Again, give you a few moments. Okay, thank you. I've just got two more short questions for you guys to answer. Just give you a few moments to think about that one. Okay, perfect, thank you. And then just one last question. Wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for doing that. We have just a few moments. So Andrew, I know at the end of your presentation, you had a little bit more about action potential and what you guys do and some links and things. I don't know if you wanted to whiz over to that bit just so everyone can see some of the great work and things that you guys do.
thank you, Louise. That's a nice reminder. Yeah, so basically, what we do a lot of the time is, well, at the moment, in lockdown, we're working live with lots of young people, one-to-ones. So after this session finishes, I'm doing another 3 hours of one-to-ones with young people, doing exactly what I've just talked about, talking them through the leaps of learning, helping them understand their brain, and helping them design bespoke sessions. And obviously those kind of resources are supported by schools. So schools pay us to do that one-to-one work in the evenings with their students, so actually they can capture the day's learning. So they'll all have done remote learning today, and it's about looking back through that learning day and helping them design that structure. And obviously we can talk about well-being as well, and anxiety. It's all about unleashing in the child that understanding that they don't need anything else. They've got a human brain. It's been evolving for 4.6 billion years, and it's a lot swisher and incredibly more powerful than their iPhone in their pocket. They just need to understand how it works.